what happens when the man you love leaves without ever knowing the truth? Claire, a brilliant child psychologist, is left shattered after her husband walks away, blaming her for their infertility. But the real twist? It was never her fault. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the power to rebuild from nothing. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Claire Bennett stood motionless in the middle of her sleek Manhattan kitchen, the morning sun catching in her hair as her coffee cup hovered halfway to her lips. Across the white marble island, her husband Lucas adjusted his navy silk tie with a familiar mechanical precision. His words hung in the air like a knife suspended mid-drop. "I want a divorce." The mug slipped from Claire's fingers and cracked against the counter, coffee sloshing out onto the pale stone like spilled blood. Her lips parted, but for a long second no sound came out. Then, softly, "What did you just say?" Lucas didn't flinch. His gaze didn't waver. "You heard me. I've thought about it. This isn't working." Claire's heart thudded hard against her ribs. 5 years. That's what this is worth to you? 5 years of marriage, and you're walking away like it's a meeting you're done with? 3 years of trying, Claire, he said, voice flat. 3 years of disappointment. We've exhausted every option. It's time. We haven't even completed the full panel of fertility testing. Dr. Patel said, "I don't need more tests to tell me what I already know." Claire stared at him, not just the man in front of her, but the stranger he'd quietly become. She remembered how he used to look at her, before schedules and calendars and timed sex and appointments had replaced intimacy. She remembered the first time they met, how he'd spilled his drink nervously at that hospital gala, stammering about cardiothoracic surgery and the future he wanted to build. That man had disappeared somewhere along the way. Lucas glanced at his watch, a Rolex passed down from his father, and Claire felt bile rise in her throat. She used to admire that confidence, that ambition. Now it felt like a wall she could never climb. My father had 3 kids by the time he was my age. His father had 4. You know this. So this is about your father, Claire said, bitter. The great Bennett medical dynasty. This is about reality, about legacy. You know how important. She cut him off. No, Lucas, I know how important it is to you, not to me. You want a trophy family to match your Harvard degrees and your surgical awards, and when my body didn't cooperate, I became defective. Replaceable. Lucas picked up his leather briefcase and slung it over his shoulder. I'm not here to fight. The apartment is yours until you find somewhere else. I've made arrangements to stay at the Langham. The Langham, she repeated, her voice hollow. Of course. Elegant. Sterile, just like you. He paused at the door, hand on the knob. This doesn't have to be cruel, Claire. Did you ever love me? She asked, and it came out quieter than she expected. Or was I just a checkbox on your perfect life plan? His lips thinned. Love isn't always enough when core incompatibilities exist. Claire laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. That's a very clinical way of saying you can't give me a baby, so I'm out. You're a psychologist, he said, his voice sharpening. You know sometimes painful decisions are necessary for long-term well-being. What I know, Claire said, standing straighter, is that you're a coward, Lucas. You don't deserve a child until you learn what it means to love unconditionally. His face twitched just slightly, but he said nothing. He opened the door, stepped out, and let it close behind him with a soft but final click. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Claire crumpled. She slid down to the polished floor, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around her middle. Everything was so pristine, the kitchen, the high-rise view, the framed wedding photo on the wall of the two of them laughing on a beach in Cabo, and all of it suddenly felt like someone else's life, someone else's marriage. She wasn't Claire Bennett, rising star in child psychology. She was just broken. Alone, a woman whose body had betrayed her, a woman no longer wanted. Her phone buzzed beside her. A text from Anna. "Lunch today? I miss you." Claire stared at the screen for a beat, then typed back with shaking fingers. "He's leaving. Everything's falling apart." The reply came instantly. "That self-righteous bastard. I'm coming now." "Don't move." Claire didn't. She couldn't. She sat there for 10 more minutes, maybe 20, maybe an hour. She didn't know. Time blurred. At some point she stood, her movements automatic. She poured what was left of her coffee down the sink, picked up the shattered mug and dropped it gently into the trash. When the doorbell rang, she opened it wordlessly. Anna swept in like a storm, her dark red curls damp from the wind, holding up a brown paper bag like a sword. "Chocolate croissants from that French bakery. We're going full emotional triage." Claire didn't even manage a smile. Anna followed her to the kitchen and set out the pastries, pulling out 2 ceramic mugs like she owned the place, which, considering how often she visited, wasn't far from the truth. "I can't believe he just dropped this on you," Anna said, handing Claire a croissant and a mug of chamomile. "No warning?" Claire shook her head. He didn't even wait for the final test results. Dr. Patel was still reviewing everything. He never went back in for his own testing. Anna blinked. "Wait. Hold up. He never got tested?" "No." Said there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with him. The great Dr. Bennett. Her voice cracked. Anna slammed her palm on the table. "Unbelievable. You spent years putting your life on hold. All the hormone shots, the appointments, the tears. And he can't even face the idea that maybe he's not genetically perfect?" Claire looked down at her lap. Her hands were trembling again. "I don't even know who I was trying to be for him anymore." Anna's voice softened. "Claire, you didn't fail. You just bent too far for someone who was never going to meet you halfway." Claire didn't respond. Her phone buzzed again, an email notification. Subject: fertility test results. Dr. Patel. She stared at it, unread. Anna saw the look and leaned in. "Are you going to open it?" Claire shook her head. "What's the point now?" "The point is, maybe knowing the truth helps you let go of the lie." Claire reached for her tea instead. The mug was warm in her hands. It grounded her. A sudden knock on the door startled them both. Claire rose slowly, opened it to find a suited courier holding a manila envelope. "Delivery for Dr. Claire Bennett?" She signed for it and closed the door gently, turned it over. The return address was from Lucas's lawyer. "Divorce papers?" Anna guessed. Claire nodded. "Want me to burn it?" her sister offered. No, not yet." Claire placed it on the coffee table like it might explode. "I hate this," Anna said, folding her arms. "You should come stay with me. Just for a while. Take some time." "I can't leave my patients. Boston has children too, Claire, and I have a guest room. and a waffle maker. Claire smiled faintly for the first time that day. She didn't open the envelope. She didn't read the email. She just stood by the window later that night, watching the Manhattan skyline blink with indifferent light, one hand on the glass, wondering how her entire world had changed between sips of coffee. Lucas had chosen legacy over love. Now it was her turn to choose something different. Maybe even herself. The corridors of Memorial Hospital pulsed with the familiar rhythm of controlled chaos. Nurses wove through traffic with clipboards in hand, intercoms chirped with new admissions, and the scent of antiseptic and caffeine lingered in the air. But Dr. Lucas Bennett barely noticed. His stride was purposeful, his shoulders squared beneath his tailored white coat, his expression unreadable. People stepped aside as he passed, instinctively recognizing the gravity of his presence. In the surgical wing, he was a legend in the making, the youngest cardiothoracic surgeon to lead a transplant team, the poster child of precision. He reached his office, closed the door behind him with a soft click, and leaned against it for a moment. Silence settled like dust. The only sound was the distant hum of life continuing outside, a world he kept just far enough away to stay untouched. The photographs on his desk caught his eye. 3 generations of Bennett men in lab coats, captured in crisp black and white frames. His grandfather, Dr. Walter Bennett, a pioneer in open-heart surgery. His father, Dr. Richard Bennett, chairman of the hospital board and the man behind most of the funding campaigns in the last decade, and Lucas himself, featured in a sleek press photo, sleeves rolled up, surgical mask pulled down to reveal a confident smile. 3 men, 1 legacy. His phone rang. Lucas exhaled, already knowing who it would be. He picked up without checking the screen. "Lucas? Your mother tells me she saw Claire at the grocery store," came his father's voice, clipped and loaded with meaning. "Alone?" Lucas closed his eyes. "I filed for divorce this morning." There was a long pause, then a measured, "I see." Lucas turned to the window, watching the sun glint off the neighboring high-rise. "We waited long enough. It wasn't working. When I said you should consider your options, I meant fertility specialists, not divorce." "What's the point?" Lucas's voice sharpened. 3 years. We did everything. Nothing worked. You think throwing away your marriage is the solution? Lucas laughed bitterly. You're the one who kept asking about grandchildren at every dinner. Claire felt that pressure. I never said she wasn't trying hard enough. You didn't have to. Lucas dropped into his leather chair, the tension in his back unrelenting. You made it clear. No child, no legacy. No legacy, no point. A sigh on the other end of the line. The Bennett name has always stood for more than biology, Lucas. No, Lucas snapped. It hasn't. You made sure of that. Your sister walked away, his father said, voice cooling. Are you following her lead now? She got out, Lucas muttered. Maybe she was smarter than all of us. Catherine abandoned her medical residency to become an artist in Paris. That's not exactly a model to follow. Lucas was saved from responding by a knock at the door. A young resident peeked in, holding a folder. Dr. Bennett, the scans for your bypass patient. Lucas waved him in, thankful for the excuse. I have to go. This conversation isn't over. Actually, Lucas said flatly, it is. He hung up before his father could respond. The resident approached cautiously, placing the folder on the desk. Lucas flipped through the scans with a practiced eye, the familiar comfort of coronary arteries and blocked vessels. Something he could fix. Something he could control. Schedule the OR for tomorrow morning. First slot. Yes, sir. The resident hesitated. Also, Dr. Patel's office called. She said the fertility test results are ready. Yours. Lucas didn't look up. Send them to my lawyer. Sir? I don't need them. We're done with that chapter. Yes, sir. The resident backed out quickly. Alone again, Lucas stared at the scans, though the images blurred together. He'd built his life on facts and outcomes, protocols and procedures. But this mess with Claire, wasn't something he could fix with a scalpel. And so he had done what Bennett men had always done. He'd closed the door, shut off the emotion, and walked away. A notification buzzed on his phone, a message from Melissa Grant, the hospital's PR director. Lunch meeting about the Pediatric Heart Center campaign? You look like you could use a friendly ear. He stared at it for a long moment. His thumb hovered. He should decline. He had surgery prep, calls to return, board metrics to review. But the thought of sitting in this office alone, with the echo of Claire's voice, "Did you ever really love me?" was unbearable. Sure. Dinner instead, 7 p.m. She replied almost instantly. Looking forward to it. Wear something less terrifying than your scrub cap. Lucas let out a breath and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That night, the restaurant buzzed with soft jazz and polished silverware clinks. Melissa sat across from him, elegant in a navy dress, her auburn hair tucked behind one ear. She was good company, witty, poised, understanding the relentless hospital world with a fluency only insiders possessed. She didn't ask about Claire, didn't mention the headlines or the whispers in the break room. Instead, they talked about campaign strategy and media outreach, about the new wing's potential and donor opportunities. All things he could master. You need to eat something, she said, pushing a basket of bread toward him. You're shrinking. You know that, right? He reached for a roll, more out of obligation than hunger. Just a lot going on. You're allowed to be human, Lucas. Not if your name is Bennett. Melissa tilted her head. Do you really believe that? He didn't answer. Back in his apartment later, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out over the city. The lights below sparkled like a galaxy, but all he could think about was the empty half of the bed behind him, the space where Claire used to sleep, where she used to read aloud from journals, snort, laugh at crime documentaries, bury her cold feet under his legs. She'd been his home long before she was his wife, but somewhere along the way he'd started treating her like an accessory to a life plan rather than a partner in it. His phone buzzed again. A text from his father. Come to my office tomorrow. We need to discuss the chief of surgery vote. Of course. Because nothing could be personal when you were a Bennett. He poured another inch of scotch, but it didn't burn like it used to. In the morning, Lucas scrubbed in for surgery. His hands were steady, his mind a blade of focus. On the table, a human heart thumped delicately under his fingers, vulnerable and exposed. He worked like a conductor, issuing quiet commands, moving with fluid precision. Here, in this room, he was godlike, respected, in control. Afterward, Dr. Patel was waiting for him outside recovery. I need a minute, she said. I'm busy. It's important. You never picked up your results. I don't need them. Claire and I are separating. That doesn't make them irrelevant. You need to know what you're dealing with, Lucas. He shook his head. Send them to the lawyer. I have more surgeries. Your pride is going to cost you more than your marriage, she said quietly. But he walked away. Later, he found himself in the hospital chapel, the stained glass casting fractured light across the pews. He didn't pray. He hadn't in years. But he sat, and for once, he didn't feel like a surgeon, or a Bennett, or even a man. He felt like a boy in a suit too big for him, trying to fill a shape he never fully fit. Outside, the world spun on, impatient and indifferent. Lucas remained suspended in a moment of stillness, haunted by a truth he refused to read, and a woman who no longer waited. Claire sat cross-legged on the rug in her therapy office, a half-built Lego castle spread out in front of her. Across from her, 8-year-old Henry carefully selected a blue brick and placed it on top of the highest tower, tongue poking out in concentration. She watched him with quiet admiration, her notepad forgotten on her lap. Sometimes, Henry said without looking up, bad things happen even if you try really hard not to let them. Claire blinked. The words landed heavy. What makes you say that, Henry? That's what you told me last week. He glanced at her, brown eyes too old for his age, like how it's not my fault my mom left, or my fault when I miss her. Claire swallowed the lump forming in her throat. You remembered that. He nodded, then tilted his head, studying her the way kids often did when they sensed something wasn't quite right in the grown-up world. You look sad today, Dr. Claire. Like how my dad looked after she left. She smiled, weakly. I guess even adults have hard days. Huh? Henry didn't push. He just added another brick, the silence between them comfortable. When their session ended, Claire walked him to the waiting room where his father waited with tired eyes and a grateful nod. She returned to her office and closed the door softly behind her, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath all morning. The Lego tower stood proudly on the floor, an accidental monument to resilience. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Anna, I'm downstairs. I brought the good croissants. Get ready to spill everything. Claire smiled, despite herself. 5 minutes later, Anna burst into the room with the energy of a small hurricane, a paper bag in one hand and her oversized tote slung over her shoulder. She wore her bakery apron like a badge of honor, smudged with flour and streaked with chocolate. You look like hell, she said, plopping into the chair across from Claire. Sexy, high-dungeoning therapist hell, but still. Thanks. That's exactly the affirmation I needed. I brought bribes. Anna pulled out 2 pastries and set them on a napkin. Chocolate almond, from Jacques, and don't pretend you're not hungry. Claire took one, picking at the edges. He didn't even wait for the final tests. Wait, Lucas? Are you serious? He said there was no point, that he already knew. Claire's voice cracked. He just made the decision. Anna's eyes narrowed. Did he ever get tested? No, Claire said bitterly. Said there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with him, that his father had 3 kids by 32, that it had to be me. Of course he did, Anna muttered, because nothing ever touches Dr. Perfect. Claire nodded slowly. He followed in their footsteps, so blindly. The family, the name, the need to be invincible. Anna took her hand. You know this isn't your fault, right? Claire didn't answer. She just stared at the crumbs on the napkin, like they might reveal a secret path out of this. I mean it, Anna continued. You fought for this marriage, you showed up, you compromised, and he checked out the minute things weren't easy. Claire pressed her palm to her eyes. The worst part is, I can't even blame him completely. I lost myself, Anna. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being me. No, Anna said firmly. You were trying to build a future. That doesn't mean you lost yourself. It means you believed in something. Claire dropped her hand and looked at her. Do you think I should open the results? Anna hesitated. Do you want the truth? I'm not sure. That's fair, Anna said, but maybe knowing it will give you some power back. Right now, you're letting him own the story, but this is your story too. Claire reached for her phone. The email from Dr. Patel was still there. She hovered her finger over the notification, but couldn't bring herself to click. Her office phone buzzed. Dr. Bennett, said her receptionist's voice, calm and composed, your 2 o'clock is here, early. Claire took a breath. Thank you. I'll be right there. After Anna left with a reluctant promise to come back for dinner, Claire saw 3 more patients. 3 children navigating trauma with the rawness only childhood could hold. Each session required her full attention. Each child asked for her compassion, her steadiness, her presence. By 5:30, she was emotionally wrung out. She returned to her desk and finally allowed herself to stare at the envelope Lucas's lawyer had sent 2 days ago. It sat in her drawer, unopened, like a loaded gun. She reached for it, pulled it out, and laid it gently on the desk. Her phone buzzed again. Dr. Patel, I understand you haven't reviewed the results. I'm here if you'd like to talk. Claire stared at the screen, then set it aside. She couldn't. Not yet. Another buzz. This time, from Lucas's lawyer. Coming by your office at 6 to collect your signature. She typed back. Don't bother. I'll have everything sent directly. She didn't want to see him. She wasn't ready for that. Another knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Anna again, this time with a second bag. Round 2, her sister said, holding up Thai food, and I brought the extra spicy curry you used to inhale when you were stressed. Claire laughed, the first real laugh in days. You're relentless. I'm not letting you sit in this office stewing in your feelings alone. That's what sisters are for. They ate cross-legged on the office couch, surrounded by dimmed lights and paperwork, like teenagers hiding from the world. I've been thinking, Anna said, chewing thoughtfully. Why don't you come stay with me in Boston for a while? I have patients, Anna. I can't just leave. Boston has kids too, and therapists. You could get a fresh start. Claire looked down at her rice. I don't know if I'm strong enough to start over. Are you kidding me? You're the strongest person I know. Claire's eyes welled up. I just feel like I failed. As a wife, as a woman. Anna reached across and grabbed her hand. You didn't fail. You're surviving. That's enough for now. After dinner, they packed up the food containers and Anna hugged her tightly before leaving. Claire locked the door behind her and returned to her desk. Her phone buzzed again. Dad, just wanted you to know. Your results are normal. No abnormalities. Call when you're ready. Claire stared at the screen. Her heart stopped for a second. Then she read it again. Normal. No issues. Her throat tightened. So it hadn't been her. All that time, all that pain. And Lucas hadn't even had the courage to face his own vulnerability. He'd walked away thinking she was the problem, when he hadn't even looked in the mirror. Claire picked up the divorce papers. Her hands were steady now. She signed with a flourish, her maiden name written with purpose. Claire Emerson. She would not be defined by his legacy. She would define her own. That night, as rain began to patter softly against the windows, she packed up a single box from her office. Her diploma, a framed photo of her and Anna, a ceramic owl gifted by a child she once counseled. She placed the signed documents in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote the forwarding address with precision. She stood for a moment, breathing in the silence, the finality. Then she turned off the lights and walked out, her heels echoing down the hall. Outside, the city was lit in gold and blue. Claire pulled her coat tighter around her and turned her face toward the future, no longer afraid of the unknown. She was stepping into it on her own terms now. One step at a time. Lucas stood outside the OR suite, scrubbing his hands with automatic precision. The antiseptic smell should have grounded him, steadied him. This was his sanctuary, his stage, his arena, the one place where he was still in control, still competent, still everything his last name promised he would be. But his hands were trembling. He clenched his jaw, forced his shoulders to still, and pushed down the storm inside. Surgery first, emotions later. That was the Bennett way. "Dr. Bennett," a nurse called from behind the glass, peeking through the door. "We're ready for you." He gave a short nod, entered the OR, and let the lights and hum of the machines swallow him whole. The procedure was a quadruple bypass, high risk, high reward, the kind of challenge Lucas thrived on. He moved with the grace of someone who had spent more time inside human chests than most people spent in their kitchens. His voice was steady as he gave instructions, as he navigated the fragile web of vessels and veins, as he coaxed life back into a heart on the edge of collapse. Outside these walls, his marriage had fallen apart, but here his hands still worked. Here he still mattered. "Baby's dropping," a resident called out, panic laced in his voice. "I see it," Lucas said calmly. "Push 10 of epinephrine." The nurse complied. Slowly, the monitors returned to rhythm. Lucas didn't look up. His eyes stayed glued to the heart, his hands still dancing. Only when the final stitch was in place and the patient was stable did he step back. Another save. Another reason not to think. He left the OR and stripped off his gown, the adrenaline draining fast. In the hallway, Dr. Patel stood waiting, arms crossed, a manila envelope clutched in one hand. Lucas froze. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him. Her eyes weren't angry, just tired. "You need to read these," she said. "I'm busy," he replied, brushing past her. "Don't do this, Lucas." "I already did," he said flatly, without turning around. "We're divorced. It's over. It's not about your marriage anymore. It's about the truth, and whether you have the guts to face it." Z hadn't stopped walking, but the envelope burned in his mind. That night, back in his apartment, Lucas poured himself a drink and sat at his desk. The city blinked at him from the floor-to-ceiling windows, 1,000 lights mirroring the 1,000 mistakes he didn't want to name. He opened a drawer and stared at the envelope. Dr. Patel's handwriting was scrawled across the front. "Confidential, patient, Lucas Bennett." For 3 months he'd avoided it, because deep down, he knew. He broke the seal, slowly, pulled out the papers and unfolded them. Words jumped out at him. Low sperm motility, below average count, treatment options available. He read the paragraph again, and again, and again. But it didn't change. His chest tightened. All those months, all those appointments Claire had endured, the hormone injections, the early mornings, the blood draws, the whispered reassurances that we're in this together. And all along, it had been him, his body, His failure? He'd blamed her. He'd left her. Lucas's throat closed up, and for a brief, terrifying second, he felt like he couldn't breathe. He pressed his palms to his eyes, letting the truth crash into him with full weight. He hadn't just walked away from a marriage. He had run away from accountability. The buzzer rang, snapping him out of the spiral. He checked the clock. Past 9 p.m. He walked to the door and opened it to find Melissa standing there with 2 coffees and a brown paper bag. "I figured you forgot to eat," she said. "Or that you were pretending you weren't hungry." He blinked. I didn't expect. You said you had a rough day. You don't have to talk about it, but you shouldn't be alone." He let her in. They sat on the couch in silence for a while, the food untouched between them. She didn't push. She didn't pry. She just sat there, offering her presence like a blanket. Finally, Lucas spoke. "It was me." Melissa glanced at him. "What was?" "The reason we couldn't have kids. It was me." She was quiet for a long time before answering. "Sorry. I made her feel like she failed," he whispered. "I let her believe it was her fault. And when she started to break under the weight of it, Melissa didn't offer cliches. Didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She just nodded. "Then maybe it's time to make things right. However you can." The next morning, Lucas found himself in Dr. Patel's office. She looked up, unsurprised. "I was wondering how long it would take." "I want to understand everything," he said, sitting down. "Treatment options, timing, what I ignored, what I need to fix." She handed him another folder. "It's treatable, but it takes commitment and time." He opened it. Diagrams, charts, protocols, medications, reality. "I should have done this months ago." "Yes," she said bluntly, "but you didn't. Now you're here. That's what matters." Lucas closed the file. And Claire. She moved to Boston, took a position at a child trauma center. She's thriving. He smiled faintly. "Of course she is." "I haven't spoken to her since the final results came back," Dr. Patel added, "but I did leave her a message." Lucas looked down at his hands. "I don't even know what I'd say." "Don't say anything unless it's honest," she said, "and don't expect anything back. Some bridges burn for good reason." Later that afternoon, Lucas found himself in the hospital chapel again. He sat in the same pew, the same light filtering through the stained glass. This time, he wasn't hiding. He was mourning. Not just the loss of Claire, but the version of himself that had let fear define his actions. His phone buzzed, a message from his father. "Board meeting tomorrow, final vote on chief of surgery. Be sharp." Lucas stared at the screen, then turned it off. That night, he pulled open another drawer in his desk. Inside were Claire's fertility appeal forms, copies of insurance denials, notes she had written in the margins, questions, plans, hope. All of it in her handwriting, all of it without his support. The next day, Lucas stood at the head of the conference room as the board voted. "Motion carried," someone said. "Dr. Lucas Bennett, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery." Applause followed. His father clapped him on the back. "You've done the family proud," he said. But Lucas felt her face did not turn blue. Her face. Later, as he walked down the hallway, badge heavier than it had ever felt, he passed a glass case. Inside, an old photograph of his grandfather. The hospital wing named after him. a legacy built in stone. But Lucas didn't stop to admire it. He kept walking, past the past, toward something he hadn't found yet, but desperately wanted. Not glory, not prestige, not the Bennett name etched in walls, but redemption. And maybe, just maybe, peace. Claire stood at the edge of Boston Common, her scarf flapping gently in the late spring wind, a cup of chai in one hand and a folded map of the city in the other. She didn't need the map. She'd memorized the area before she ever stepped off the train, but holding it gave her something to focus on, something solid, something that said, I belong here now. 3 weeks had passed since she'd signed the divorce papers and packed the last of her life into cardboard boxes. 3 weeks since she left the Manhattan skyline behind in her rearview mirror and pointed herself toward a city that had no memories of Lucas Bennett. In Boston, she wasn't the failed wife of a renowned surgeon. She wasn't the woman who couldn't give a man the legacy he thought he deserved. Here, she was just Dr. Claire Emerson. Her new apartment was modest compared to the penthouse she once shared, but it was hers. A second-story walk-up in a quiet corner of Back Bay, with creaky floors and a brick fireplace that didn't work but looked beautiful all the same. She slept on a mattress on the floor, still waiting on the delivery truck from New York, and ate takeout on paper plates, but the space already felt more like home than her last 5 years ever had. Her new job started Monday, senior child psychologist at Harborview Children's Center, a trauma clinic specializing in early intervention. The staff had welcomed her with enthusiasm, grateful to land someone with her credentials, unaware of the personal storm she was still weathering. She'd smiled through the tour, nodded at the introductions, all while something inside her whispered, "Start over, build again." That whisper had grown louder every day. Now, as she sat on a park bench watching children laugh and chase bubbles, she realized something strange. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was being crushed under the weight of disappointment. She was alone, yes, but she wasn't lonely. She had space to think, to breathe, to choose. Her phone buzzed, a calendar alert. Fertility consultation, Dr. Quen Guin, 3:30 p.m. Claire stared at the screen. She'd made the appointment almost on a dare to herself, a challenge whispered from some brave corner of her soul. Do this for you, not him. Never for him again. When she arrived at Dr. Julian's office, tucked inside a glassy medical center near the harbor, she didn't feel nervous, just focused, determined. The waiting room was warm and minimal. Soft jazz played over hidden speakers. A few magazines lay unread on the table beside her. Claire smoothed her skirt and glanced at the intake forms she'd already completed online. There was a single line she'd filled out with absolute clarity. Desired path to parenthood. Single mother by choice. Dr. Gwynn welcomed her with a kind smile and an outstretched hand. Dr. Emerson, I've read your file. Your previous results from New York look excellent. No red flags. That's rare for someone who's been through so much. Claire returned the smile, modest. I've had enough false alarms to keep me cautious. Well, we'll proceed one step at a time, Dr. Nguyen assured her. You've indicated that you'd like to pursue donor insemination. That's becoming more common, especially among professional women. Do you have any preferences? Open donor? Anonymous? Genetic traits? Claire took a breath. I haven't decided. I just know I don't want to wait anymore. I've spent too long letting someone else dictate the story. I'm ready to write my own. Dr. Nguyen nodded approvingly. We'll start with a new round of labs. Ultrasound to check your ovaries, hormone panels. After that, we'll go over donor profiles together. It felt strangely empowering, talking about possibilities rather than limitations. Claire left the clinic with a folder of paperwork and a quiet fire burning in her chest. By the time she got home, dusk had painted the sky in deep lavender hues. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and settled onto her bare mattress, opening the folder like it held blueprints for a secret future. Her phone buzzed again, this time a video call. Anna's face filled the screen, hair up in a messy bun, flowers smudged across her cheek. "Tell me everything," she said before Claire could even say hello. "I'm pacing the kitchen like an expectant grandmother." Claire laughed. "First appointment went well. They'll call me tomorrow to schedule the initial labs." Anna squealed. "Oh my God, you're doing it. You're really doing it." "I think I am." "Claire, I'm so proud of you. I mean, look at you. New city, new job, new uterus plans." Claire grinned. "Don't call it that." Anna wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Listen, when you start looking at profiles, I want to help, just for moral support. I won't try to convince you to pick someone with dimples or a French accent." Promise-ish? After they hung up, Claire curled under the one blanket she'd unpacked and stared at the ceiling. She imagined the sound of tiny feet on those creaky floors, the smell of baby shampoo, the chaos of toys in the hallway. She let herself picture it. Clear, vivid, beautiful. She wasn't chasing Lucas's dream anymore. She was finally chasing her own. Over the next few weeks, the routine settled into place. She started her new job, met her patients, slowly filled her apartment with furniture and framed photos. Her days were spent helping children untangle the roots of trauma, their resilience reminding her every day that healing was always possible, even after the deepest wounds. At night, she pored over donor profiles. She read about education levels, family medical history, personal essays. She ruled out anyone who sounded like they were trying too hard. She circled those who mentioned music, kindness, curiosity. One Friday evening, after a long day of back-to-back sessions, she sat on the couch with Anna on speakerphone. "Okay," Anna said, chewing something loudly. "I've read through the top 5. The one who climbed Kilimanjaro, definitely overcompensating." I said the same thing. "Number 4 sounds grounded," Anna continued. "Loves animals, volunteers at a literacy program, and his favorite movie is The Princess Bride." Claire smiled. "Yeah, he's my favorite too." "You going to pick him?" "I think so." And just like that, the future began to take shape. A new kind of hope settled into her chest. Gentler, steadier. Not the desperate hope she'd once clung to in sterile clinics with Lucas beside her, but something warmer. Something real. Her first IVF cycle was scheduled for the following week. The night before her first injection, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding the needle like a pen, her reflection blinking back at her. The fear was still there, small, buzzing, but it didn't win. She pressed the syringe into her abdomen and exhaled as the medication flowed. "Done," she whispered to her reflection. "We're doing this." The weeks that followed were a blur of early mornings, ultrasounds, hormone swings, and hopeful waiting. Claire went to work, kept her routine, and refused to let anxiety take over. She journaled, meditated, let herself feel joy when it came. And when the test finally came back positive, pregnant. She cried. She cried in the clinic bathroom, in the parking lot, all the way home. And then she laughed, a bubbling, full-body laugh that scared her neighbor's cat. She was going to be a mom, alone, by choice. And somehow, she'd never felt more whole. That night she called Anna, who screamed so loudly Claire had to hold the phone away from her ear. The next morning, Anna showed up at her apartment with 24 croissants and a world's best aunt mug. Later, as he walked down the hallway, badge heavier than it had ever felt, he passed a glass case. Inside, an old photograph of his grandfather. The hospital wing named after him. A legacy built in stone. But Lucas didn't stop to admire it. He kept walking, past the past, toward something he hadn't found yet, but desperately wanted. Not glory, not prestige, not the Bennett name etched in walls, but redemption. And maybe, just maybe, peace. Claire stood at the edge of Boston Common, her scarf flapping gently in the late spring wind, a cup of chai in one hand and a folded map of the city in the other. She didn't need the map. She'd memorized the area before she ever stepped off the train, but holding it gave her something to focus on, something solid, something that said, I belong here now. 3 weeks had passed since she'd signed the divorce papers and packed the last of her life into cardboard boxes. 3 weeks since she left the Manhattan skyline behind in her rearview mirror and pointed herself toward a city that had no memories of Lucas Bennett. In Boston, she wasn't the failed wife of a renowned surgeon. She wasn't the woman who couldn't give a man the legacy he thought he deserved. Here, she was just Dr. Claire Emerson. Her new apartment was modest compared to the penthouse she once shared, but it was hers. A second-story walk-up in a quiet corner of Back Bay, with creaky floors and a brick fireplace that didn't work but looked beautiful all the same. She slept on a mattress on the floor, still waiting on the delivery truck from New York, and ate takeout on paper plates, but the space already felt more like home than her last 5 years ever had. Her new job started Monday, senior child psychologist at Harborview Children's Center, a trauma clinic specializing in early intervention. The staff had welcomed her with enthusiasm, grateful to land someone with her credentials, unaware of the personal storm she was still weathering. She'd smiled through the tour, nodded at the introductions, all while something inside her whispered, "Start over, build again." That whisper had grown louder every day. Now, as she sat on a park bench watching children laugh and chase bubbles, she realized something strange. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was being crushed under the weight of disappointment. She was alone, yes, but she wasn't lonely. She had space to think, to breathe, to choose. Her phone buzzed, a calendar alert. Fertility consultation, Dr. Quen Guin, 3:30 p.m. Claire stared at the screen. She'd made the appointment almost on a dare to herself, a challenge whispered from some brave corner of her soul. Do this for you, not him. Never for him again. When she arrived at Dr. Julian's office, tucked inside a glassy medical center near the harbor, she didn't feel nervous, just focused, determined. The waiting room was warm and minimal. Soft jazz played over hidden speakers. A few magazines lay unread on the table beside her. Claire smoothed her skirt and glanced at the intake forms she'd already completed online. There was a single line she'd filled out with absolute clarity. Desired path to parenthood. Single mother by choice. Dr. Gwynn welcomed her with a kind smile and an outstretched hand. Dr. Emerson, I've read your file. Your previous results from New York look excellent. No red flags. That's rare for someone who's been through so much. Claire returned the smile, modest. I've had enough false alarms to keep me cautious. Well, we'll proceed one step at a time, Dr. Nguyen assured her. You've indicated that you'd like to pursue donor insemination. That's becoming more common, especially among professional women. Do you have any preferences? Open donor? Anonymous? Genetic traits? Claire took a breath. I haven't decided. I just know I don't want to wait anymore. I've spent too long letting someone else dictate the story. I'm ready to write my own. Dr. Nguyen nodded approvingly. We'll start with a new round of labs. Ultrasound to check your ovaries, hormone panels. After that, we'll go over donor profiles together. It felt strangely empowering, talking about possibilities rather than limitations. Claire left the clinic with a folder of paperwork and a quiet fire burning in her chest. By the time she got home, dusk had painted the sky in deep lavender hues. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and settled onto her bare mattress, opening the folder like it held blueprints for a secret future. Her phone buzzed again, this time a video call. Anna's face filled the screen, hair up in a messy bun, flowers smudged across her cheek. Tell me everything, she said before Claire could even say hello. I'm pacing the kitchen like an expectant grandmother. Claire laughed. First appointment went well. They'll call me tomorrow to schedule the initial labs. Anna squealed. Oh my God, you're doing it. You're really doing it. I think I am. Claire, I'm so proud of you. I mean, look at you. New city, new job, new uterus plans. Claire grinned. Don't call it that. Anna wiped her hands on a dish towel. Listen, when you start looking at profiles, I want to help, just for moral support. I won't try to convince you to pick someone with dimples or a French accent. Promise-ish? After they hung up, Claire curled under the one blanket she'd unpacked and stared at the ceiling. She imagined the sound of tiny feet on those creaky floors, the smell of baby shampoo, the chaos of toys in the hallway. She let herself picture it. Clear, vivid, beautiful. She wasn't chasing Lucas's dream anymore. She was finally chasing her own. Over the next few weeks, the routine settled into place. She started her new job, met her patients, slowly filled her apartment with furniture and framed photos. Her days were spent helping children untangle the roots of trauma, their resilience reminding her every day that healing was always possible, even after the deepest wounds. At night, she pored over donor profiles. She read about education levels, family medical history, personal essays. She ruled out anyone who sounded like they were trying too hard. She circled those who mentioned music, kindness, curiosity. One Friday evening, after a long day of back-to-back sessions, she sat on the couch with Anna on speakerphone. Okay, Anna said, chewing something loudly. I've read through the top 5. The one who climbed Kilimanjaro, definitely overcompensating. I said the same thing. Number 4 sounds grounded, Anna continued. Loves animals, volunteers at a literacy program, and his favorite movie is The Princess Bride. Claire smiled. Yeah, he's my favorite too. You going to pick him? I think so. And just like that, the future began to take shape. A new kind of hope settled into her chest. Gentler, steadier. Not the desperate hope she'd once clung to in sterile clinics with Lucas beside her, but something warmer. Something real. Her first IVF cycle was scheduled for the following week. The night before her first injection, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding the needle like a pen, her reflection blinking back at her. The fear was still there, small, buzzing, but it didn't win. She pressed the syringe into her abdomen and exhaled as the medication flowed. "Done," she whispered to her reflection. "We're doing this." The weeks that followed were a blur of early mornings, ultrasounds, hormone swings, and hopeful waiting. Claire went to work, kept her routine, and refused to let anxiety take over. She journaled, meditated, let herself feel joy when it came. And when the test finally came back positive, pregnant, she cried. She cried in the clinic bathroom, in the parking lot, all the way home. And then she laughed, a bubbling, full-body laugh that scared her neighbor's cat. She was going to be a mom, alone, by choice. And somehow, she'd never felt more whole. That night she called Anna, who screamed so loudly Claire had to hold the phone away from her ear. The next morning, Anna showed up at her apartment with 24 croissants and a world's best aunt mug. Claire took the day off work. She lay on the couch with her sister, staring at the ultrasound photo that confirmed it all, a tiny, bean-shaped blur. "Your baby," Anna whispered. "All yours." Claire traced the outline on the image with her thumb. "No," she said. Hours. They sat in silence, side by side, as the Boston rain tapped gently on the windows. For once, the storm outside felt like a blessing, a cleansing, a soft, steady lullaby for a brand new beginning. Lucas stood alone in the surgical locker room, staring at the reflection in the mirror. His face looked older than it had 3 months ago. Sharper angles, hollowed eyes, a faint gray creeping into the temples. His scrubs hung a little looser. He'd been skipping meals, hiding in operating rooms, spending more time in silence than he used to. Not because the work had increased, but because it was easier to keep moving than to stop and feel. The title of Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery didn't feel like a crown. It felt like a collar. He turned on the faucet, scrubbing his hands even though his shift was over. He couldn't shake the ritual. Wash away the doubt. Wash away the guilt. Wash away the image of Claire's name on that fertility report, right next to the word normal. Every time he thought about it, his stomach twisted. For 3 years, he'd let her carry the weight. He'd let her inject herself with hormones, sit alone in cold exam rooms, endure the silent judgment of every family gathering where someone asked, "When are you two going to give us some good news?" And all the while, he had been the one with the problem. But instead of facing it, he'd blamed her, and then left. He dried his hands slowly, the paper towel scratchy against his skin, as if penance came in small abrasions. The locker room door creaked open behind him. "You're still here?" Melissa's voice was soft but surprised. "It's after 8. Lucas glanced at her in the mirror. She stood in her usual trench coat, a folder tucked under her arm, her auburn hair pulled back. "Lost track of time," he said. "You missed the fundraiser debrief. I figured the photos would speak for themselves." They did. "You look very noble next to the new wing banner," she teased gently, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Is everything okay?" Lucas hesitated. For weeks now, they had been moving toward something. Dinners, long walks, text messages that lingered a little too long. Melissa had been patient, understanding, kind. But Lucas knew deep down she wasn't waiting for him. She was waiting for the man he used to be. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "About Claire, about..." What happened? Melissa walked over and leaned against the locker beside him. You don't owe me that, Lucas. I know, but I need to say it. So he told her. About the test results, about his fear, his avoidance, the way he'd let Claire carry the shame alone, and how he'd use legacy as a shield against his own vulnerability. Melissa listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, the room was silent, except for the distant sound of monitors beeping down the hall. Thank you, she said finally, for telling me. I don't expect forgiveness. Good, because it's not mine to give. Lucas looked down. I still care about you, Melissa. I don't know what I'm capable of right now. Melissa placed a gentle hand on his arm. Then be honest with yourself. Figure it out. I'm not going anywhere, but I'm not going to wait around for a ghost either. She left without another word, the door clicking softly behind her. Later that night, Lucas sat at his desk with the manila envelope in front of him. Claire's test results, printed and annotated by Dr. Patel. He'd read them 100 times by now, memorized every line. But tonight, he noticed something he hadn't before. A note in Dr. Patel's handwriting. This was treatable. She never gave up. Lucas leaned back in his chair, the weight of those 6 words anchoring him. He opened the bottom drawer, pulled out another folder, this one filled with Claire's appeal forms to insurance companies. Each one carefully worded, typed neatly, signed with her maiden name. She had fought so hard. And he had left. A knock broke the silence. He expected a nurse, maybe one of the residents. Instead, it was Dr. Patel herself. I thought you'd still be here, she said. Lucas gestured to the envelope. I was just going over the results again. I know. I saw the records request from your assistant. You've been reading them for weeks. He gave a small, guilty smile. I didn't know what to do with them, what to do with myself. Start treatment, she said, matter of fact. Not for Claire, not for what you lost, for you. I'm not even sure I want kids anymore. That's not the point. The point is that you finally stop hiding from your own truth. Lucas nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it. The first weeks were awkward. The hormone therapies, the blood work, the morning appointments before surgeries. It was humbling, vulnerable work, the kind he'd once dismissed as Claire's burden. Now it was his, and he bore it without complaint. Dr. Patel didn't let him off easy. She tracked his progress with cold efficiency and warmer eyes. Once she even smiled and said, You're doing the work. I didn't think you had it in you. Neither did he. One afternoon, after a long double bypass, Lucas returned to his office to find a package on his desk. No return label. He opened it carefully and found a copy of a medical journal. On the cover, in bold letters, Childhood Resilience After Loss. Dr. Claire Emerson. His throat closed. He flipped through the pages, reading her words. Clinical, precise, but threaded with warmth. She spoke about children who had survived abandonment, about those who had rebuilt their sense of self after the people they trusted most walked away. She hadn't used his name, but he felt it in every line. That night, Lucas didn't go home. He sat in the on-call room, reading the article again and again until the sun began to rise. The first light caught the edge of the journal, casting a glow across her photo on the author's page. She looked radiant, whole, like she had finally stepped into the life she was meant for. He wondered if she'd ever think of him again. Then his phone buzzed. A message from the chief of pediatrics. Portland Children's Hospital just announced a partnership with Claire Emerson's trauma program. They're asking for Seattle Grace's neurosurgery support. Lucas stared at the message for a long time. Across the country, Claire was building something extraordinary. And now, fate was throwing them back into each other's orbit. The next morning, Lucas walked into the hospital's administrative boardroom with the journal in one hand and a decision in the other. When the board asked if he would lead the neurosurgery collaboration with Portland, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "and I'd like to visit in person." He didn't know what he expected to find there, but he knew what he hoped for. Not forgiveness. Not a second chance. Just the opportunity to look her in the eye, not as a man running from his past, but as someone finally willing to stand in it. The conference hall in downtown Chicago buzzed with anticipation. Physicians, psychologists, and hospital administrators from across the country filled the rows of sleek, chrome-backed chairs, their name tags swinging from lanyards, cups of lukewarm coffee clutched tightly in their hands. The annual Pediatric Psychology Summit was the kind of high-level, invitation-only event where reputations were built, and sometimes repaired. Claire stood backstage, her hand resting protectively over the small but unmistakable swell beneath her dress. 6 months pregnant. Not exactly the way she had envisioned presenting her first national keynote, but then again, nothing about this year had gone according to plan. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer and tapped the side of her tablet to wake the screen. Her slides were loaded, her speech was rehearsed, not to perfection, but with heart. And that's what mattered now. The paper she was presenting, on early childhood resilience after familial loss, had already gained attention in professional circles. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just a psychologist sharing data. She was living proof of the very thing she was here to speak about. The stage manager approached and gave her the 2-minute signal. Claire nodded, her heart pounding in her ears. Somewhere out there, in one of those chairs, sat Lucas. She hadn't seen him in over 4 months, hadn't spoken to him since the divorce papers were finalized, but she'd been told he was attending. Of course he was. The new chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Seattle Grace had his own presentation later in the week. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of timing she couldn't outrun. The announcer's voice rang through the microphone. Our next speaker is a leader in trauma-informed therapy for children and families, and a fierce advocate for early intervention. Please welcome Dr. Claire Emerson from Harborview Children's Center. Applause swelled. Claire walked out under the bright lights, her heels clicking against the polished stage floor, her stomach suddenly tightening. Not with fear, but something deeper. A reminder that she wasn't alone, that she was carrying a future now, one not dependent on anyone but herself. She clicked to her first slide, a photograph of a child's drawing, a stick figure family with a heart hovering above it. Her voice was steady as she began. We often talk about trauma in terms of damage, but I've found that when it comes to children, trauma can also be the seed of growth. What matters most isn't what happens to them, but who walks with them afterward. She moved through her presentation with practiced ease, weaving clinical insight with real-life cases. She spoke of children abandoned, children grieving, children rediscovering joy. And as she talked, she felt a quiet stillness settle over the room, the kind of stillness that only comes when people are truly listening. In the Q&A portion, a few questions trickled in from the audience. thoughtful, respectful, academic. Then a familiar voice floated up from the back of the room. "Thank you for joining us," Lucas said, standing. "How do your findings apply to cases where abandonment was rooted in medical challenges, for example, infertility?" Her breath hitched. Of course he would ask that. She found him in the crowd. He looked tired. Not broken, but not whole either. His suit fit him impeccably, but his eyes were softer now, the edges dulled by humility. Claire didn't flinch. She met his gaze. "From a clinical standpoint," she said, voice even, "the cause of abandonment matters less than the recovery that follows. Children are remarkably resilient. With the right support, they can rebuild trust, even after the deepest fractures." Lucas gave a small nod, accepting the answer, but his eyes stayed on her. When the session ended, Claire packed her materials quickly, hoping to disappear before any awkward run-ins could unfold. But he was waiting near the exit. "Claire," he said, stepping into her path. She froze. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach. "You look... well," he said, voice catching slightly as his eyes dropped to her belly. "Congratulations." "Don't," she said quietly, stepping back. "You don't get to pretend this is normal." "I read the results," he said. "All of them. I should have done it sooner." She looked at him, at the pain etched into his face, at the remorse he wore like a second skin. And still, her voice didn't waver. "It wouldn't have changed anything. You left long before you saw the truth." "I was scared," he admitted, "of failing, of not living up to everything." She nodded once. "And I was scared too, but I stayed." He didn't argue, just stood there, hands at his sides, searching her face for some sign of softness. She gave him none. "I'm seeing Dr. Patel," he said, "started treatment. I hope that brings you peace." He hesitated. "Do you hate me?" Claire looked away. Outside the conference windows, snow had begun to fall in soft flakes, blurring the view of the city skyline. "I did," she said, "but hate's heavy, and I've got enough to carry." A voice called her name from across the room. "Anna," holding her coat, waving gently. Claire gave Lucas a final nod, then turned to go. Behind her she heard another voice, familiar, authoritative. "Let her go, son," said Dr. Richard Bennett, emerging from the shadows. "Some mistakes can't be undone." In the hotel lobby, Claire leaned against the wall, heart pounding. Anna appeared beside her a moment later. "You okay?" Claire smiled faintly. "Better than okay." They stepped outside into the crisp evening, arm in arm. Claire felt the twins flutter, their tiny movements a grounding presence. As they walked to their hotel, Claire's phone buzzed. A message from Harborview Children's Center. "Board has approved your proposal. You're officially head of pediatric trauma. Congratulations, Dr. Emerson." She showed it to Anna. "I knew it," her sister said proudly. "New title, new babies, new life." "You're crushing this." Claire laughed, the sound light and true. "I think I finally am." Back in her hotel room, she hung her name badge on the door handle and opened her laptop. She had a list of nursery items saved, and it was time to finally start ordering. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Lucas, I saw the ultrasound pictures. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. They're beautiful." Claire stared at the screen for a moment, then deleted the message without responding. She had said everything that needed saying. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the city in quiet. Inside, Claire placed a hand on her belly and whispered to her daughters, "We're just getting started." The pediatric conference in Boston was a whirlwind of presentations, press coverage, and networking. But it was the laughter, unfiltered and pure, that caught Lucas off guard. He stood near the entrance of the reception hall, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Claire. She was kneeling beside two little girls in matching navy dresses and sparkly sneakers, carefully helping them unwrap tiny award gift bags. Their curls bounced with every movement, their small hands excitedly waving pencils and stickers in the air. One of the girls squealed when she found a pin shaped like a heart. The other reached for Claire's hand instinctively, as if that touch was the most natural thing in the world. Lucas's chest tightened. He knew without needing to ask, these were her daughters. His daughters? Claire looked radiant. Her long, honey-brown hair was swept up in a loose bun, and her eyes sparkled with something he hadn't seen in years. Joy. Not the polished joy she'd once worn to galas on his arm, but something softer, more rooted. The joy of a woman who had survived something, and built something better. A man approached from the side, smiling as he took one of the girls into his arms and kissed her on the cheek. Claire stood and leaned into him easily, the familiarity between them undeniable. Lucas recognized him from a brief article he had read weeks ago. James Martinez, fellow child psychologist, recently married to Claire Emerson. It had been a small, quiet ceremony. No press, no headlines, just a photo of the two of them standing in a Boston garden, Claire in a simple ivory dress, holding the hands of her two daughters. Lucas turned away, pretending to study the spread of hors d'oeuvres on the linen-covered table. "Ready, Dr. Bennett?" the event coordinator asked, her clipboard clutched to her chest. He nodded, adjusting his tie. "As I'll ever be." But when he took the stage and launched into his presentation on innovations in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, the rhythm that usually guided him faltered. His voice, steady as ever, belied the storm behind his eyes. Every word he spoke felt detached, mechanical, like he was watching himself perform rather than living in the moment. When it was over, the applause came on cue, polite and professional. But Lucas didn't linger. He stepped down, handed his microphone to the technician, and headed for the nearest side exit. Out in the courtyard, the night air bit at his face, crisp and laced with the scent of wet pine. Snow hadn't started falling yet, but the air warned it was close. He sat on a cold iron bench, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Dr. Patel. "Test results look good, round 3 is promising. Want to schedule next steps?" He didn't respond. A moment later, another text came through, this one from Caroline. "Want to leave early or meet me for dinner?" She had been patient with him, supportive, but Lucas knew she'd started seeing someone new recently. He'd encouraged it, even. They'd never officially been a couple, just two lonely people orbiting each other for a time. Now, that orbit had shifted. He replied quickly, "I'm good, thanks for everything." The reply came with a thumbs up and a heart emoji. And that was that. Lucas let the phone drop to his lap. He rubbed his hands together, watching his breath fog in the air. In a different life, had he chosen courage sooner, he would have been the one helping little girls open gift bags. He would have been the one they called Daddy. But he hadn't chosen courage. He'd chosen silence. A small voice echoed across the courtyard. "Mommy said you're a doctor, too." Lucas looked up to see one of the girls, Ella, if he remembered correctly from the article, standing a few feet away. She stared at him with wide brown eyes, her hands buried in the sleeves of her sweater. He smiled gently. "I am. I work on hearts." She blinked. "So does Mommy, but with feelings." Lucas chuckled softly. "She's always been better at that than me." Ella tilted her head. "Are you sad?" The question caught him off guard. "A little," he admitted. She nodded, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "I get sad too, but then I draw a picture and eat grilled cheese. It helps." He smiled again. "That's good advice." "Bye," she said simply, and turned to run back toward the reception hall, curls bouncing. Lucas watched the door swing shut behind her. Inside, through the tall windows, he saw Claire rejoin her girls and James. They were laughing, they were whole. He stayed on the bench until the snow started to fall. The next morning, Lucas returned to Seattle. The hospital was quiet, his inbox full of board memos, follow-up requests, and surgical schedules, but he ignored them all. Instead, he walked to Dr. Patel's office and sat down, without an appointment. "I want to finish the treatment," he said, "all the way through." Dr. Patel looked up, studying him carefully. "For the right reasons this time?" He nodded. "For me. No expectations, no legacy. I just want to be healthy. I want the option." She handed him a new folder. "Then let's get started." Weeks passed. Lucas threw himself into work, but not to escape anymore. He spoke more kindly to residents, checked in on nurses, took breaks. He started seeing a therapist at Dr. Patel's urging. He even called Catherine, his sister in Paris, and talked to her for 2 hours about everything and nothing. She cried when he told her the truth about Claire. "I always liked her," Catherine said. "She made you more human." "I wasn't brave enough to deserve her," he said. One day, Caroline stopped by his office with a manila envelope in hand. "Found this while organizing old PR files," she said. "Thought you'd want it." Inside were the old ultrasound photos from Claire's presentation. Twin girls curled like commas on the grainy screen, their heartbeats tiny but strong. He stared at the names scribbled in the margin. Sophie and Lily. Claire had named them. She'd moved forward. She had built a life. And somehow that made him feel proud. The next month, Lucas traveled to Portland for the first quarterly meeting of the Joint Trauma Program between Harborview and Seattle Grace. The conference room was bright and modern, sunlight slanting in through wide windows. Claire sat at the head of the table, a laptop open in front of her, her posture calm and commanding. She barely looked at him. The meeting ran smoothly. Clinical updates, integration timelines, staffing plans. When it ended, Claire gathered her things quickly, but Lucas caught her at the elevator. "I saw the pictures," he said quietly. "Sophie and Lily. They're beautiful." She didn't answer. "I'm not asking for anything," he added. "I just needed you to know. I'm sorry. For all of it." Claire's eyes met his briefly. There was a flicker of something. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or simply recognition of the man he was now. "You lost your place in our story," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean you can't write your own." The elevator dinged open. She stepped inside. "Take care, Lucas." "You too, Claire." As the doors closed, he stood still for a moment, watching his reflection in the polished metal. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a shadow. Back in Seattle, Lucas visited the hospital chapel. He sat in the same pew where he once hid from the truth, but this time he sat upright. He closed his eyes and breathed. Outside, the rain had given way to sunlight. A small patch of it streamed through the stained glass and landed on the floor beside him. A reminder: some losses aren't recoverable, but some lives can still be rebuilt, and some endings were never endings at all. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this emotional journey. If you're still here, it means the story touched something in you, and I'm truly grateful for your time and heart. What can we take away from this story? Sometimes life doesn't unfold the way we planned. Sometimes love isn't enough if we don't have the courage to face our own flaws. But even in the aftermath of heartbreak, there's room for healing, strength, and new beginnings. Claire's journey reminds us that we are not defined by the people who walk away, but by the choices we make after they do. Now I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know your city or country. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's free, and it helps you stay updated every time we share a new, powerful story, just like this one. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and never be afraid to choose yourself.